Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to today's virtual launch of the Economic and Social Survey for Asia and the Pacific 2020. I'm Paul Bunsell. I look after communications at the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP, as we call it, and I'll be moderating today's session. To answer questions on this report, I am absolutely delighted that we have with us Mr. Hamza Malik, the director responsible for all of UNESCAP's work on macroeconomic policy and financing for development, and Ms. Shweta Saxena, one of our senior economists who headed up the team looking after macroeconomic policy and all the analysis that goes into that. Hamza and Shweta will begin by providing an overview of the 2020 survey's key findings before we move on to the Q&A. They're going to touch on some of the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, but principally focus on the long-term economic strategies needed to build a more inclusive and sustainable economy in our region. You can ask questions while the presentation is ongoing through the YouTube channel, to which there are links on the UN-ESCAP website, or you can send us an email at escap-scas@un.org. That's escap, ESCAP-scas, @un.org. We'll collect them, all of your questions, and put them to Hamza and Shweta at the end. Please do remember to state your name and the organization you work for when putting those questions to us. So I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Hamza and Shweta, and I believe Hamza in the first instance, to take us through the main findings of the survey. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, colleagues, friends, professionals joining from around the region for our launch. Let me get straight into it. Actually, let me start with a quote from Arundhati Roy, a nice article she wrote over the weekend called "The Pandemic is a Portal." That sort of sets the scene for our fundamental messages. And I begin the quote. Coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. End of quote. So as you'll see, main focus of our research in this particular publication for some years now has been to rethink what Ms. Roy calls a doomsday machine of a very GDP growth-centric development approach that has actually come at a cost to people and planet. So let me get straight to the messages part now, and I'll start the key presentations there. Okay, so we'll try and leave you with three fundamental messages. As I just said, the economic growth-centric development approach being pursued in the region has not been people and planet friendly. And as you must have seen from our colleagues from the Statistics Divisions launching their SDG progress report, that Asia Pacific is not on track to achieve any of the sustainable development goals. In particular, the goals related to sustainable consumption and production and environmental well-being needs much more effort. So one key message from our side is the economic growth-centric approach needs to be revisited, and we'll share some ideas on that line. The second key thing, of course, is the current economic slowdown has been considerably exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And our message over here is the policy response should be primarily initially focused on people's lives and their health. And then, of course, economic recovery will be the key. However, we should not use this as use the crisis as an opportunity to continue our journey towards the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And we'll be happy to share some ideas how we can do that. The pandemic and climate emergency, which is another long-standing issue and a big serious issue, essentially requires policymakers to move away from what we term as short-termism towards a long-term vision. And it requires collective policy actions across the board from governments, from businesses and consumers. And it needs to be underpinned by much more strengthened global and regional cooperation. So let's start with the fundamental messages, which essentially the first one, as I was saying, GDP growth-centric development approach has come with costs to people and planet. Move on. Okay, so you'll see here the trajectory of GDP growth over the last 20 years or so, normalized to 100 in the year 2000. It has been on an upward trajectory. Then it has actually reaped benefits for the economy. For instance, employment generation is key one. Income generation for people, the GDP per capita has been rising. And poverty headcount, as measured through $90 per day, has been on a declining trend. So we all understand these some of the very obvious benefits of having high and sustained economic growth, generation of employment and poverty reduction. However, as we'll show you, once we look a little more in details, the situation changes. So over here, we show the poverty headcount in an inverse scale on the right-hand scale. So increase in poverty headcount actually is a decline that you see. Same figure as last slide. So again, GDP increase has led to poverty reduction measured through $90 per day. However, once you look at the $3.20 per day metric, the progress is not that great. And similarly, the moment you increase the metric to $5.50 per day of poverty headcount, again, the progress is not that great. So the point is, yes, there have been gains, but once you look in the details, they're not that substantive. Similarly, when you look at the inequality dimension or distribution of that increase in GDP and income, it's pretty worrying, actually. We have been saying this thing in our various publications, the high and rising inequalities in Asia and the Pacific region. As you can see in this particular graph, almost 50% of pre-tax national income goes to the top 10% income groups in Asia. That's pretty significant. You can also see that the share of the bottom 50% and middle 40% actually has been stagnant at best, and in some instances declining. So again, the gains of rapid and sustained economic growth over several years has not led to equal distribution of those gains. Similarly, when we continue to try to assess how the GDP increases has fared or has impacted the planet side, we see significant increase in GDP corresponding to significant increase in domestic resource use to feed into that production machinery. And as a result, it has actually resulted in rapid and sustained increases in CO2 emissions, contributing to damage to the environment and so on and so forth, and exacerbating the climate emergency, as we call it. So when we put it together, the whole 2030 agenda, the bottom line upshot is very clear from where we started. This is a very holistic framework. It looks the 2030 agenda of UN. It looks at both the all the three pillars of sustainable development, economic, social, and environment taken together. What you see here is that the region should have been in the middle bar line around 2009 if they are to achieve all the sustainable development goals by 2030. You see the blue bars essentially showing in some goals significant achievement has been there. However, more work is needed. But what is most worrying is the red bars, which are going in the wrong direction, which pertain to goal 12, responsible consumption and production, and goal 13, related to climate action. So the region essentially is regressing when it comes to these particular goals. And that is why in this particular issue of economic and social survey of Asia and the Pacific, we zero in on this particular angle and trying to dig deeper into what is going on into the consumption and production processes in an economy and what can be done to make sure the direction of this particular red bar is corrected and the benefits for the entire sustainable development increases. So progress on goal 12 actually is very critical, a very effective way to accelerate progress towards the 2030 agenda. What we simply see in this particular slide is the interrelationships between goal 12 and several targets across many other goals, be it on poverty and hunger, be it on education, on growth, goal 8, on sustainable and clean energies, so on and so forth. So by paying attention, by improving progress in goal 12 on responsible consumption and production, the region can actually accelerate progress across the entire 2030 agenda. So how do you go after improving progress on goal 12? Well, we need to pay attention to our consumption behavior and production processes. And for that, we essentially go into the details of 3 key stakeholders in the entire process, which are governments, businesses, and consumers. They all need to change their behaviors if we are to make progress towards sustainable consumption and production. Just some examples, which my colleague Shweta will go in the details of kind of policy measures that are needed, are listed here, but we will be discussing these details shortly. So the fundamental challenge, of course, is the near-term economic conditions pose significant obstacles in this kind of progress towards improving situation in goal 12, and then, of course, for sustainable development as a whole. What you see here is the actual data so far of GDP growth in developing Asia-Pacific region. You immediately can notice that even before 2020 began, the growth trajectory has been on a downward trend. It was a high of 5.8% in 2017, and 2019 actual estimates show it's going to be about 4.3%. So irrespective of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, the region was on a slowdown economic trajectory. When we compare with this, what we were saying on the same subject, on the same growth trajectory last year, we were anticipating a much less decline from 5.3 in 2018 and to 5%. This was the projection we made in our last update last year. When we try and go forward now, there are significant challenges trying to project or forecast what's going to be the impact incorporating this COVID-19 pandemic or prolonged trade tensions and many other related issues. What we do see is a significant deviation between what we were saying last year, which means the growth would have stabilized around 5% of GDP. However, now it's actually going to continue to decline significantly below 4.3%. We have not shown an actual number, as you can see, for 2020 for the region's average GDP growth. The reason is fairly obvious. The pandemic is still evolving rapidly. It has led to substantial uncertainties as to the channels, multiple channels through which it is affecting people's livelihood and economies and sectors and so on and so forth. Hardly any actual data has emerged yet to give substantive numbers. So to add a specific numbers to us would be adding another element of uncertainty to an already uncertain situation. So what we are essentially highlighting is that the impact of COVID-19 on economies will be significant, substantial. Even an economic recession or contraction in some instances cannot be ruled out. For 2021, at this point in time, we do expect a rebound. However, to the extent of rebound remains to be seen, and it will depend on when the data starts to emerge and when the situation settles a little bit. Right now, it's basically extremely uncertain to try and pin down numbers because those numbers are going to become meaningless, I think, in a month or 2 months' time anyways. So the message is very clear. The deceleration or contraction in economies or negative impact on GDP is going to be significant. Let's continue. What can be done about this kind of situation? So, of course, we try and distinguish between immediate measures that are needed to handle the situation. And then we'll discuss very briefly some of the medium and long-term measures that need to be put in place. So in terms of immediate measures, we believe fiscal policies will have to take the lead. Large and very targeted fiscal measures are needed to contain and respond to the impact of COVID-19 on economies in various sectors. Just to give you an example, this is to ease the shock to jobs and guarantee minimum living standards for ordinary people. Much more attention, much more targeted approach will be needed to make sure the vulnerable population groups' needs are adequately addressed. The little bit upshot of good news on this front is that Asia-Pacific region as a whole have sufficient fiscal space, and they can and should respond very proactively. Of course, there are countries where fiscal space is relatively limited, but as a whole, the region is in far better shape than many other regions. So here's the basic data on the fiscal space. What you see is fiscal balance as a share of GDP. On average, the very first left bar for the SCAP region as a whole is this is the median fiscal balance numbers, is about 1% of the region, which is very, very low. Similarly, when you look at the breakup of these regions, you see the South and Southwest Asia has significantly higher fiscal imbalances or fiscal deficit, but for other sub-regions, things are pretty in a good shape. Similarly, when we move on and we look at the fiscal debt numbers, public debt to GDP ratios, again, you see the average for the entire region is around 40%, a little under 40% of debt to GDP ratio. So countries can afford to increase their fiscal deficits when they start spending more to deal with the COVID implications, and they can issue more debt or accumulate more debt to deal with the situation. Immediate run, we see that should be the priority. Government should give as much certainty and assurance to its populations as possible that they will be here. They are here to take care of the people in these very unprecedented times, and they have the fiscal space and policy tools to do that. The reassuring thing is many countries have already stepped up a range of measures to try and contain the impact of pandemic, immediate ones, and now there are conversations on how to try and mitigate the adverse implications for the economy. Again, South and Southwest Asia situation is a bit different from other regions, so some nuanced or sectors, sub-region specific information may be needed for that. So other supporting measures are, of course, other than fiscal policies, are targeted monetary easing. This has to be there to ensure that overall financial sector health remains intact, because as businesses finding difficulties, it will have repercussions for the banking sector and the financial sector as a whole. So monetary authorities will need to inject liquidity, significant liquidities, to make sure the initial liquidity crunch does not turn into a solvency issues. And similarly, significant support will be needed for the small and medium enterprises. And regional cooperation, the two areas where we have highlighted. Of course, there are several other examples available. One is region should consider establishing a public health emergency fund to deal with the immediate needs of the region as a whole in a collective manner. And the other is, as countries expand their fiscal positions and accumulate further debt, there may be a need for several developing countries for some sort of more space or debt relief or deferral of their debt payments to give them and create space for them to continue supporting their people and their economies. So in terms of medium to long term, I won't say much. I only say one of the fundamental message for us is it's about time that we have been highlighting it for several years now, that countries step up their investments in emergency health preparedness and in strengthening their social protection systems to deal with exactly the kind of pandemics that is creating havoc across the entire globe. And the investments for these kind of purposes are not that onerous. They're pretty affordable. They should be stepped up. And that is one way we look at as an opportunity now. These kind of investments not only going to help deal with the pandemic itself, but also prepare the economies to move towards 2030 agenda, sustainable development agenda, in a much more coherent manner. So I hand over now to my colleague Shweta to take it from here to zero in on the aspects of sustainable consumption and production and a range of policy measures that we are proposing.
Sorry, I have to jump in here, Shweta, and ask you to unmute yourself, please.
Is it good? Okay. Thank you, Hamza. So the current pandemic is a lesson that we should never ignore longer-term issues as they come to haunt us in the present. Rather, the pandemic could be a game changer to urge all stakeholders to focus on long-term sustainability, as just Hamza was mentioning. So this is particularly important given we are also facing a climate emergency. If we continue on business as usual, it'll mean that our economic growth will still heavily depend on resource use, which will continue to contribute to increases in greenhouse gas emissions, at least in the next 3 decades. So as we enter into the decade of action, the Secretary General has called for universal actions at local, people, and global levels to accelerate sustainable solutions to all the world's biggest challenges, including the climate emergency. For the Asia-Pacific region to combat climate change risks and to transform our production and consumption patterns, we need to bring all stakeholders along, including governments, businesses, and consumers, with the world as a community of common destiny. Hence, strengthening global and regional cooperation will be critical to achieve such a transition. To address the impending climate emergency, governments have to play a key role in leading the transition out of fossil fuels by making climate change a priority. To achieve so, governments should remove fossil fuel subsidies, which at $240 billion are higher than the investment into renewable energy. The savings from such subsidies could be used to fill in the investment gap towards achieving the affordable and clean energy goal. And of course, given the lack or underpricing of carbon in its overuse, governments should introduce a carbon tax that can discourage the use of carbon and hence lower carbon emissions, while at the same time generating tax revenues that can be used to compensate people who lose from such a tax or to increase investments in renewables. As new investments needed to move towards a low carbon economy go through the financial sector, governments can take measures to green the financial systems. This can be done by providing financial incentives, such as preferential lending terms and tax breaks for green investments, or through regulatory incentives that support sustainability reporting, disclosure, and transition. This can help in this transition as well by internalizing the externalities of their business operations. This can be done by incorporating ESG considerations in making decisions. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance factors. The 3 factors together measure the impact of a business activity on society and the environment. They help to better assess and determine the future financial performance of companies. One simple way of incorporating ESG is to sign up for membership in the United Nations supported Principles for Responsible Investment and follow the PRI's guidelines on assessing and reporting of responsible investment activities. So far, about 15% of PRI signatories are from the Asia-Pacific region. Another way is for companies to disclose their business climate-related risks by following the TCFD guidelines. These are voluntary and help in understanding the impact of climate change on a business. So far, of the 930 signatories, 43% are from the Asia-Pacific region, but mostly from the developed countries. Businesses can also reflect the true cost of their activities by putting a monetary value on greenhouse gas emissions. There is a growing consensus that carbon pricing is the most effective way to cut carbon emissions. Of the companies that have disclosed the use of or plan to implement carbon pricing, 35% are from the region. Now, such transparency and disclosures of social and environmental aspects of business activities can help socially and environmentally conscious investors to make investment decisions. This can help channel funds into sustainable products and businesses. Our next stakeholder, consumers, they can certainly do their part by choosing sustainable lifestyles. For instance, they can choose ride sharing, use public transport, opt for energy efficient home appliances to reduce their own carbon footprints. Here again, governments and businesses can help consumers move towards these lifestyles through, say, nudging, where consumers are encouraged to make sustainable choices. For example, Singapore has introduced a mandatory energy label on energy appliances to encourage the purchase of energy efficient products. And it can also be done by incentivizing the sharing of idle and underutilized resources. For instance, platforms for ride sharing facilitate the use of underutilized resources such as vehicles. Now, such local and people actions by governments, businesses, and consumers can also be strengthened through global and regional cooperation. Cross-border cooperation is crucial to prevent inaction and raise ambitions on climate-related goals. For instance, Cooperation can be enhanced by harmonizing climate-related standards to reduce trade friction and accelerate the diffusion of green products and services. And we can also enhance this by cooperating on climate risk management, given the ability of the region to test new models and technology. Countries can also move towards, they can accelerate decarbonization by developing regional carbon markets. In our own region, 26 countries have expressed their interest to engage in the use of market-based approaches in their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And they can also scale up transboundary power trade and transmitting electricity from countries rich in renewable energy resources to those that are reliant on fossil fuels. Lastly, sustainable development must be understood as ensuring that everybody can meet his or her basic needs without compromising the basic of human survival or at the expense of future generations. As the value chains for most products and services is spread across countries, regional cooperation is needed to create an enabling environment for SCP hands. Hence, countries should strengthen such cooperation through the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production. To conclude, as Hamza had started off, the current challenging economic conditions, they threaten to set back the region's progress towards the 2030 agenda. But the silver lining is that Asia and Pacific still has ample policy space to respond. The COVID-19 pandemic emphasizes that long-term benefits should never be sacrificed for short-term gains. In fact, it can become a catalyst to change the development approach that should put people and planet first. And this is particularly important for our region because it's also facing a climate emergency. It's not the job of one or two people. All stakeholders have to come together and act collectively. Governments should prioritize sustainability and decarbonize their economies. Businesses should internalize the externalities of their business conduct, and consumers should be more mindful of their lifestyles. Should enhance global and regional cooperation towards more ambitious solutions. Thank you for joining us today, and now I will return the floor to my colleague, Paul. Thank you, Paul.
So thank you very much, Shweta and Hamza. And if I could ask you to now take your slides down, that would be great. Now we're going to start with the Q&A session. I'd like to remind everyone watching that they can still ask questions if they have some, and they should send them to us either on the YouTube channel or send us an email. And I'd like to start with a question from Yuan at Phoenix TV, who'd like you to tell us a little bit more about the impacts of the pandemic outbreak in Asia and the Pacific, both on its economy and on its society. And could you tell us a little bit more about the difficulties that this might create in terms of the region achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals? Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for sharing these questions from colleagues. As we try to explain, the impact of the COVID-19 on economies and societies are going to be profound. We haven't seen anything like that before in any of our lifetimes. Be it the personal lives, how they have been affected, be it how we organize our work on daily basis, how we connect with each other on personal basis and as societies and as regional and global value chains of production systems, and so on and so forth. So the impact are going to be very, very far-reaching, so to speak, and significant. There's going to be a significant, as I was saying, contraction or reduction in economic growth, which in turn, of course, then relates to the second question, will have implications to the ability of countries to try and pursue the 2030 agenda ambitions much more effectively. Slowdown economy activities, for instance, reduces government revenues and their ability to sort of put in place the measures that are needed. However, as you might have noticed in our presentation, that we can try and use this as an opportunity in a sense. I think we have all learned together that sudden and profound change is possible. After all, we have been forced to work from home and we've all learned to do that. Similarly, the climate emergency has been out there for some time, and there have been a call for changes in behavior across the board. However, there has been inertia in not making the necessary changes. So as countries go forward, policymakers go forward in trying to deal with the immediate impacts, they should use it as an opportunity to direct their policy measures that actually can support the pursuit of sustainable development goals. And the key priority should be, in our advice, is invest in health and social protection systems. That is going to be the key to take care of the people and not put them in this kind of vulnerable position. Remember, the fundamental message of the 2030 agenda essentially is leave no one behind. And the impact of the crisis, pandemic actually, is most severe for those vulnerable groups of people. So they need the support, and we should not put them in this kind of situation again. Similarly, the investments and adjustments in policies needed for climate action are there, have been there for some time now. And we are reiterating, use this crisis as an opportunity to do things differently. Let's not try and go back to the normal that we had before. Let's try and create a better world together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very clear. Now I'd like to put to you a question from Meng Xiao, who's writing to us from Xinhua News Agency. Could you tell us a little bit more about ESCAP's forecast for the Asia-Pacific region? I mean, I know you mentioned the difficulty of being accurate at that at this stage, but how much will it be affected by COVID-19? Again, I think you touched a little bit on that, but most importantly, how should the region ensure economic stability in this particular time?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for this question. It's a very obvious and very important question, to be honest. That's why I was trying to spend a little more time. We have tried not to put numbers per se. When we do the forecast and projections at professional economists, we normally rely, and everybody relies on actual data to the extent possible, to feed into our models, to feed into our assessments, and so on and so forth. There are no data points that are available. That's one point we have emphasized. However, you might have noticed many organizations have put out some initial estimates, but they are changing literally week by week basis. To us, it's actually creating more uncertainty rather than assuring people. So from our side, the fundamental message is the impact is going to be significant, the likes of which probably we have not seen before. It could be even more severe than the 2008-2009 crisis, when the region, along with the globe, experienced massive contraction and decelerations. So it's a very real possibility. Then the impact on different subregions or different countries is going to vary considerably, depending on the prevailing economic conditions and challenges, and to the extent they have been affected by the pandemic, or to the extent how they have been related across border in different countries. And all of that remains to be seen. It's not even barely a 1 month. So I would not put out a number out there. However, reiterate the same message, the impact could be as significant, if not more, than the 2008 crisis, and some countries should brace themselves for contraction. Now, the second part of the question is much more important, how to ensure stability. I think initially all policy instruments should be used at a full throttle. What I mean by that is, irrespective of fiscal positions, government should really go out and help people. They should not be debted because their fiscal space is not that much, or they have high debt, or their fiscal balance is out of shape. Those are conventional yardstick, conventional wisdom. We are not living in conventional times. We really have to think out of the box. They really have to reorient, readjust their existing budget reallocations and redirect towards those areas which requires immediate need. At the same time, to ensure economic stability, be it financial markets or otherwise, central banks will have to step in, and they're already doing that by injecting massive amount of liquidities, targeted cash support, and credit lines, so on and so forth, to keep the businesses afloat. And they should, and they should continue to think unconventional ways of trying to go after that with the one objective in mind. Let's take care of the people now, and then we worry about much more how to do the recovery part and reviving part, which is also very important. But in these crisis situations, you have to be very, very clear in the messages to regain, from the government's point, the trust that people want to have them, then the reassurance they want from the governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And there's a follow-up question from Meng Xiao at Xinhua. She says, during the pandemic, there's some voice that the global value chains over-rely on China, which affects other countries' economic performance when China started to be hit by COVID-19. How will this affect globalization? How will this affect the development of global value chains?
Of course, China has been, not only in the region, globally has been the center of these production value chains, and their role have been, I would say, very, very constructive as a whole throughout. Global value chains or regional value chains create huge opportunities for countries. It creates jobs, for instance, it creates incomes. It leads to innovations and so on and so forth. It supports the overall global economy, which we normally say Asia has been the engine of economic growth globally. So I won't say there's too much or too less. However, the point on globalization is very valid. In our assessment, I don't think so. We are going to go back to the old way of typical globalization where the emphasis is no matter what, let's try and enhance globalization. That is not likely to happen and probably should not happen. We should be very, very careful in how we are promoting globalization. It has to be inclusive. It has to be much more cautious of the carbon footprint, for instance, of their activities. A very deliberate cooperation effort should be put in place. We don't go back to the old way of doing things. So I don't think so the globalization of old times or the recent times actually is going to be the case and should be the case. It will be a different world. We don't know, for instance, what is the optimal level of globalization, for instance, right? So financial globalization, just to give you one example, created havoc around 2007 and 2008 period. It was excessive. But how do you define excessive? There was a massive decline, deceleration, but general understanding was that it had gone too far, right? So similarly, those kind of assumed and implicit optimal points should be revisited and rethought, that we should not pursue these more and more globalization no matter what, rather make a much more cautious and gradual approach if needed, and bring in the elements of sustainable development, bring in elements of inclusiveness and job creation and environment sustainability and those things. That might slow things down, but we might end up creating a much more better connected, globalized world economy. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a question here from Hannah Fernandez, who's an eco-business correspondent. And there are sort of three questions, but they're all interlinked, so I'm going to read them out in one go. If governments invest more in emergency health services, will other SDGs not be prioritized as much? And if yes, what's the implication? What does that mean for Asia and the Pacific? And does it mean it will not meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? Over to you.
Thank you, Paul. No, I am not saying that. We are not saying that investments in emergency health services will compromise other investments. It's the nature of the crisis, the unprecedented nature of the crisis, and prioritization. These kind of investments in health and social protection should have been there in the first place, and that has been there for some time now. So we are right now saying, let's not use this opportunity now and step up those investments. And the second point, which we also try to highlight in the context of our presentation, it's an integrated global agenda. The goals are interlinked. So investments in certain areas automatically help achieve areas and other things. So investment in health will help poverty indicators, for instance. It will help productivity and thus growth indicators and so on and so forth. The point we were highlighting, once you try and go after sustainable consumption and production patterns, it affects numerous other sustainable development goals. So in the context of the pandemic, the urgency is for investments in health and social protection measures. However, this will benefit other sustainable development goals as well. So there will be some slowdown or trade-off, but the general trajectory is going to be there. In fact, the last part of your question, if I understand it correctly, does that mean that Asia is not likely to meet SDGs? I don't think so. At this point in time, there are huge gaps where we should have been and where we are, but we still have a decade to go. That's a call, what we're calling a decade of action. And this is the time actually to take those actions. We still have 10 years. I don't think it's too early to say that we will not be meeting those goals actually. It's just actually Investments need to be reoriented. Like Shweta was highlighting, stop investing in fossil fuel-based industries and go after those that have much less carbon footprint. We need to nudge the entire financial system's behavior, investors' behavior, consumers' behavior to do that. That was coming up. So it can be done. The key point to remember in the context of this question and pandemic is some prioritization has to be happening given the nature of the crisis. Right now, people need help. Health is a serious issue. People's lives is the ultimate priority. Go after that immediately, take care of that, and then start rolling in investments in areas that take things forward, both the economic recovery part as well and dealing with the climate emergency angles. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I have a question, I think, which sort of comes on the back of that from the Green Council. And the question is as follows. Is there an inverse relationship between GDP growth and sustainable consumption?
Not really. I think if we pursue consumption or even production for that matter in a sustainable manner, it might slow down the pace of growth to some extent initially. But once the system internalizes that, it doesn't have to be a long-term trade-off. What it means is you can have, provided the necessary measures are put in place for some sustained period of time, can have sustained GDP growth and pursue it in a manner that is consistent with the principles of sustainable consumption and production. Clearly, when the adjustment has to take place, there might be some sort of a disconnect between the two. And sustainable consumption indicators go up, so GDP might slow down a little bit. So in that sense, there may be a little bit of a trade-off in the short term or an inverse relationship. Reiterating the same point that these goals are integrated. You reap so many other co-benefits by going after one aspect of sustainable development, in this example, sustainable consumption and production, and you reap benefits on so many other accounts, which in the end actually reiterates the point. The second point on reiteration is why GDP is the metric of success to begin with. We are talking about 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development. GDP growth is an extremely important component of that. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Our metric of success has to go to the sustainable development as defined broadly by 2030 Agenda. So even if in the short term, sustainable consumption production it causes some sort of slowdown on the GDP or the growth part, as long as it's many other components of sustainable development agenda, to me, it's a win-win situation. Is the metric has to be sort of revisited and kept in view that eventually this is the whole point. Shweta, you want to add something? I see.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, thank you, Hamza. I just wanted to add, there is not necessarily an inverse relationship, as Hamza was explaining, basically. When GDP does go up, when incomes go up, people do tend to consume a lot more. But the point is when they start consuming more, they start consuming some of the products that end up actually making climate a little bit worse. For instance, they move from plant-based diets to animal-based diets that actually have higher carbon footprints. They start buying cars, they start driving, that of course has a carbon footprint. So the point is that as consumption goes, as incomes go up, definitely consumption goes up. However, if these same consumers do not find sustainable products to buy and consume, this trend will continue. And one of the good things I just want to highlight from our region is that 2/3 of the consumers are willing to pay a higher price for sustainable products, which means because I think in our region, a lot of the people are seeing the downsides of climate change, of environmental degradation. 97 of the top 100 air polluted cities are in our region. So people see that and experience it on a daily basis. So they really do want to move towards more sustainable consumption. The question is, how do they move towards that? And I highlighted in the presentation that governments and businesses can help them move towards such choices. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you. And again, on the back of that, I think it segues quite neatly. Ahmed Rizal Khalek asks us, from a colleague from UNDP, asks us, perhaps after COVID-19, we might see an acceleration towards SDG 12 and 13. and indicate an economic significant based on the current trend during the pandemic. What's your view on that? So will we see an acceleration towards SDG 12 and 13? And SDG 12 is, of course, responsible consumption and production, and SDG 13 is climate action.
Shweta, you want to start off with that, and then I'll jump in if needed.
Thanks, Hamza, and thanks, Paul. Yes, actually. So basically, in the post-COVID world, given that I just highlighted in our own presentation that climate emergency is such a big deal for Asia Pacific, and goal 12 is the one place where we are regressing the most. But if you recall the slide which Hamza had shown, that goal 12 is actually linked to so many of the other goals that it really becomes the most cost-efficient way for us to move towards the 2030 agenda by really tackling one goal, which is basically goal 12. Hamza, do you want to add something?
No, I think you covered exactly what I was going to highlight. Unless there's a follow-up.
Thank you very much. No follow-up, but maybe something that's a little related, and let's broaden this out a little bit. So this is from Professor Shaleen Singhal from the School of Advanced Studies in India. And the question is, how do we engage with those mandated with marketing for increased consumption?
Go ahead, Shweta.
Well, that's highlighting that its consumers need to be a little bit more mindful of their consumption behaviors. Yes, there is so much of marketing we cannot deny. We have to buy not just one cell phone, but a new cell phone every 3 months. There is so much of marketing. So I mean, like, you have to think about if these businesses can market that you need to buy a cell phone every 3 months, then it can be counteracted by some of the other things where governments can nudge people into moving towards the sustainable lifestyles as well, sustainable consumption and production, consumption behaviors, basically. There could be similar to the advertisement we see for buying cell phones or the latest gadget. We can also see governments actually trying to encourage, through nudging, as I mentioned, behaviors that they deem are environmentally more responsible. For instance, in India recently, just as an example, not so much related to the climate change, but the fact that there was this whole drive for Clean India, right? The government started it and people have started caring about it. So this is just one of those ways of nudging people in the right direction, so to speak. So it falls upon a little bit on the governments too, to nudge people to adopt more environmentally favorable lifestyles. Another example where governments can help people make much better choices in terms of transportation, which is a big area where our greenhouse gas emissions come from, is by providing public transport system. Improving that, just investment in that would mean that they can actually be, led to not be so driven by seeing new advertisements for cars, new cars and stuff like that. So there are lots of ways that governments can actually help move towards that. Thanks.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question, which is, in many ways, Asia Pacific has been ahead in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. How can we systematically extend what we've learned to the rest of the world?
Sorry, Paul, your voice was breaking a little bit. If you don't mind, can you repeat the question, please?
Absolutely. So it's a follow-up question, and it says, in many ways, Asia and the Pacific has been ahead in dealing with the COVID-19 epidemic. How do we systematically extend what we've learned to the rest of the world?
If I understand your question, you're saying Asia-Pacific region has been ahead in many ways in dealing with COVID and how those lessons can go across the globe, right? Okay. UN in the region here in Asia Pacific and globally actually has been extremely agile and nimble and moved very, very quickly. So there are several processes that are in place where ASCAP is actually a part of that, both at the global level and at the regional level, and then supporting countries' efforts. what this means is, in the first stage, of course, we came up with a whole bunch of assessments and areas and impacts and what needs to be done and where and so on and so forth, and a range of policy measures and advice and government and working with the data. But in terms of the context of the specific question, the very next stage is the sharing of lessons learned is going to be critical, and that's where SCAP, regional commissions like ASIAPacific.
Okay, we clearly have a connection problem with Hamza, so may I ask Shweta to step in on that particular question, please?
I think just to pick up where Hamza was, oh, he's back.
I got dropped out. Can you hear me now?
Very clearly. Please take off where you got cut off.
Can you guys hear me?
Very clearly.
Yes.
Okay, if we're clearly not hearing you, Hamza, so we'll let you.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can, yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'm going to suggest that we turn to Shweta.
Okay, I think I see that you guys can hear me, but there's a connection issue with the video. So if there is a interruption, if you don't hear my voice, please let me know. Let me try and reiterate. I was trying to explain how a regional commission like SCAP is now working with the other UN bodies in the region, as well as global counterparts, to try and distill the fundamental message or sort of case studies that are coming out of the region's experience, which from other regions outside the region and other countries in the region can learn tremendously what kind of measures have been put in place and how they have been successful, what are the variations that exist, which areas to focus more on and how, and so on and so forth.
Very clear. Thank you very much. Shweta, would you like to add anything to that? Okay, in that case, we'll move on to Ajit Jha from United News of India. And he asked, thinking about COVID-19, has India's policy been the right one? Is it on the right line? And I'm going to hand over to Shweta, I think, on that one, please.
Okay, so just to answer, yes, India's policy has been on the right line, basically, because earlier this last month, when it was declared that, we should maintain social distancing, so it's pretty much started off from that and moving towards a lockdown and implement and giving a fiscal package of about 1% of GDP that was unveiled in order to improve the health sector, and also in order to be able to feed some of these most vulnerable people. So everything was actually done accordingly, and I think even the Reserve Bank of India stepped in at the right time in order to put in place the measures so that they can actually help some of these small and medium-sized enterprises. So yes, indeed, actually it has been. Now the question is, could it be larger? Perhaps as the time goes on, government has to reassess whether more of this kind of measure needs to be put in place. But that only time will tell, and the government will reassess for sure. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Shweta. Now I'd like to move on to a question from Professor Andreas Neef from the University of Auckland. And he would like to hear a little bit more about the preparedness and coping strategies of health sectors in some of the poorest countries in South Asia and the South Pacific. I don't know the degree to which your report looked at that, but maybe you could talk more broadly about the preparedness of those countries and maybe a bit more about the response of the poorest countries faced with such a pandemic. Thank you. So, Shweta, can I turn to you and can I ask you to unmute your mic, please?
Oh, okay. Do you want me to address this question? So it's not that we have very specific information on about every single country in the region, and our report talks about it, but just to give you a sense that yes, it has been a lot harsher for some of the more poorer countries in the region to deal with it, given that this pandemic is actually highlighting how poor the health and sanitation systems are, how poor the social protection systems are. So that is exposing a lot of people to the devastating things that are unfolding from this pandemic. I think most of the countries are kind of taking actions in terms of locking down and practicing social distancing, which so far has been the only thing that has been prepared. Of course, even when the health systems of most advanced countries are not being able to deal with the pandemic, what to talk about some of these least developed countries. And that's why, as Hamza had mentioned, that what needs to be done, well, right now, whatever needs to be done, but going forward, there should be a little bit more emphasis on preparedness in terms of health emergencies and stuff like that. Plus, as Hamza also mentioned in the presentation, there is really a big role for regional cooperation as well. So some of these countries that do not have the fiscal space or do not have the measures, they need to all come together and help each other. Something that was started was in South Asia was in the SAARC, where they've set up a little fund where everybody's contributing to that fund in order to deal with this current pandemic. And something of that sort should happen in more of the other sub-regions as well, and even at the regional level in Asia Pacific. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you. So now I'm going to come to you with a question on from Marjorie Pamintuan. And Marjorie would like to know, how have trade and investment agreements led to unsustainable or sustainable consumption and production patterns in the region? And what do you see as important in terms of reforms in that sector? And how could they contribute towards a sustainable consumption and production?
Okay, so just to give you a sense of when we think of sustainability, we are thinking about sustainability in terms of environmental, social, and governance factors, right? So where these trade agreements have done or not done enough is in terms of making sure that when these products are produced in other countries, if actually factories move to some of these lower income countries, do the same level of standards for labor and environment are met or not. So that's where I think possibly the trade agreements can really help, when we all come together and decide what exactly is a sustainable product. Okay, what constitutes sustainability? In that regard, Asia has a lot to learn from the EU. EU recently came out with these standards for what is green and what is sustainable. So something like that we can develop in our own region, so everybody's on the same page of what constitutes a sustainable product, what constitutes a sustainable production method, and that's how we can move forward. But so far, not much emphasis had been given to these kind of issues. I'm pretty certain, seeing the climate emergency in the region, these issues are picking up and will take form. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Shweta. I have a question from the Suki Consumer Network. What's your advice to Philippine consumers whose choices are limited and access to utilities and services like health and water are affected by privatization? What are your thoughts on policies in that area, and any advice to consumers directly you might have?
Okay, so the point is, in our last year's report, we had mentioned how much, in order to move towards the 2030 agenda, how much would it cost all these countries to actually provide universal health care, to provide access to clean water and all these other utilities. And we came up with a number last year of about the whole region, the developing Asia Pacific region, needs an additional $1.5 trillion every year in order to move towards the 2030 agenda, which is about 5% of the GDP. For a region that's as large as Asia, it was less than $1 per person per day. So it's quite affordable. Now, the question is actually, some how can some of these goals be achieved? For instance, you mentioned something about health. People are actually spending a lot more on health and water and all those kind of, or don't have access to them. That's where government needs to step in, because these are some of the sectors where you know that private sector is not going to come in. So some of these sectors where we need more funding, government has to provide that. So in goals 1 to 4, which is about poverty reduction, hunger, tackling hunger, providing healthcare and education, these are some of the places where government has to take more of the onus in terms of providing them rather than the private sector. And of course, consumers do have, you say that consumers have a limited choice. Of course they do, but if governments can help them with some of the basic needs, I think it'll unleash a lot of their resources in order to be able to live a better lifestyle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we're going to move on to a question from JC Mercado, who says, you've said that the top 10% have captured 50% of the wealth created, but why are the solutions directed towards more growth without addressing this basic problem and inequality? And I'm going to see if Hamza is back with us and whether he might like to try and answer this question.
My computer, yes, I think, can you hear me now?
Very, very, very clearly, Hamza, yes. Please.
I'm on my phone now. There was something going with the computer, not getting connected. My apologies for that. I got the last bit of the question. Can you please repeat it?
Of course. So we have a question from JC Mercado, and he says, you said that the top 10% are capturing 50% of the wealth created, but why are the solutions directed towards more growth without directly addressing this problem? And he's pointing to and suggesting inequality.
Okay. I think the focus and the thrust of our messaging this year has been mostly on the climate-related elements and how to tackle with those issues directly. So the policy package we are presenting is keeping in view that our primary theme is to moving towards sustainable economies. This is not to say that we are not in favor of promoting inclusiveness and those kind of things. I think a year ago or 2 years ago, ASCAP did produce an entire report on inequalities and how to handle those policies across the entire region. So many of those aspects were covered there in terms of policy recommendations, how to make those policies consistent with growth aspirations and sustainable development agenda aspirations. The reason we were highlighting this disparity of income today was to zero in on the point that as a whole, region have focused much more on the growth acceleration for the sake of growth acceleration and not paid sufficient attention to inequalities or distribution of that income or its impact on the environment. Then the focus was entirely on the planet or environment part for this particular publication. But there are a series of other work done by ASCAP that actually zeroes in on the inequality aspects and how to improve those outcomes and so on and so forth. One point that comes out in this particular report that sheds light on the inequality issues directly is the message on need for investments in health and social protection system, for instance, especially on those who are much more vulnerable. And that is an indirect way of addressing the inequalities, in a way providing equal opportunities for most people, which in turn then feeds into the inequalities of outcomes like incomes and so on and so forth. So in a way, it's an integrated policy package, but the focus, as I said, was on climate much more than the inequality per se.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question from Ajit Jha from United News India. And the question is, or his kind of proposition that he's asking you to comment on is that in a world where political parties depend on funding from industry, why should they dissuade marketing, which is not sustainable, for consumption that is not sustainable? So I'm going to, again, broadening out the debate on the back of your survey, I'm going to hand that back over to you.
Okay, let me try and respond. The very simple answer is we are all living in the same climate and the same planet. We share everything. So if their actions, be it excessive marketing for things which are causing harm to the environment, for instance, and the government is trying to nudge them or put in place policies that helps the situation, it is in their best interest to respond. That's the point at times is being lost, I think, because in terms of specifics, most what we call stakeholders, even governments or businesses or consumers, are very inward looking, have been inward looking, focusing primarily on their immediate considerations. Government have been focusing on generating revenues and immediate gains in growth and incomes, and so on and so forth. Businesses have been focusing mostly on profits, irrespective of the impact of their activities on externalities. And consumers, same way. We have been consuming more and more, facilitated by marketing, not realizing the impact of their excessive consumption on carbon footprint or on the environment, right? The upshot of the entire message of today's conversation is, well, they all have to work together if we are to tackle the climate emergency. So they all have to pitch in their part. Governments will have to take the lead in giving the framework, the policies, nudging, but their actions will not have the desired impact unless and until other consumers and other businesses support the government and then do their bit. Shweta, you feel free to elaborate if you want to.
No, I just want to add actually to what you just said, Hamza. The point is not about actually banning advertisements so that, private companies cannot be selling their products. However, governments can step in and help car manufacturers, adhere to the environmental standards. Okay. So through the regulation and all these kind of other policies, they can tell businesses to be actually producing in a more sustainable way. So if they're producing sustainable products, there's no problem actually people buying those sustainable products as well. So there are lots of things that governments can do that way as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And now I'm going to move to a question from Ritesh Kataria from the Mahindra Group. The question is as follows. As a post-COVID response, we talk about creating a new normal. How is this new normal different from the one we'd imagined in the past? And how are we going to fund it, given that economic priorities are very likely to change following the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, global, as a citizens of global community, we have been in these kind of situations in different ways, maybe not to that scale, but 100 years ago, we had a influenza of that scale where massive disruptions and so on and so forth things happened. We vowed to change the economic system after 2008, 2007, 2008 crisis. And for many commentators, economists, the desired changes were not put in place. We kept on essentially going back to the old way of doing things. To us, when we use the word unprecedented crisis, require unprecedented measures, well, we actually mean that. Unprecedented means you have not done it before. Now you have been forced to do things the way we were just talking about, but now we are actually doing those changes in behavior. We are not driving our cars on a daily basis and contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, because we're not going to work. But in the meantime, we have learned wherever opportunities are there, digital connectivity is there, to work online as well. Of course, collectively, there are a lot of disruptions. Not everybody can connect online and do their work or so on and so forth. The second point is, yes, financing is going to be an element in trying to go after investments in those areas. But there are two observations in this regard. A, financing is one aspect of what is needed to try and push and create for a new normal, a new world. Important ones, but not the only ones. There are significant behavioral changes that we are talking about that can be instituted. And on the financing or investment needs aspect as well, like we last year in 2019 Economic and Social Survey, we provided estimates for the region-wide investment needs. And they were less than $1 a day per person on average, not a very big task. Then when we look at the available financial resources across the system, it turns out there are literally trillions of dollars that are out there and available. They're not being channeled towards investments that are needed to achieve sustainable development. And hence the call for changes in behavior and reiterating the point again and again. Let's change our focus away from only growth promotion and bring in elements of inclusiveness and sustainable and environment sustainability. The whole package has to be done in a holistic, collective manner. It will require investments, but it will also require behavioral changes.
Shweta, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, just a quick thing to what Hamza just said, that yes, how to channel. I mean, like, in our last report, we did mention that there are too many trillions and trillions of dollars, but somehow they don't get channeled into these SDG areas. So one of the things we are highlighting this year is how can they be channeled. So when I was presenting that businesses can do a lot, right? They can adopt and incorporate all these environmental, social, and governance factors, which means that if they actually let everybody know that they are a sustainable and a business and they're producing sustainable products, consumers these days and even investors are looking for such sustainable investments. So this is the easiest way to actually attract sustainable investment into all these sustainable businesses and sustainable products. So just to highlight that, moving to in that area would really help.
Thank you. And I have a question now from Vanita Sunija from WaterAid India. And the question here is, as a long-term measure of investment on public health, or in public health, do we need to define the ambit of health in terms of access to safe water, hygiene, food, nutrition, fair wages, living conditions, green spaces? We need to define them all as preventative health measures. And how do we go about that, and how do we promote it and advocate for it? So that very broad question. Happy to hear from both of you on this one, but Vanita is particularly keen to hear from Shweta on it. She indicates in her question.
Shweta, why don't you start then?
Okay, thank you, Vanita, for your question. So all these things, whether you talk about from a perspective of post-COVID world, I think sometimes Hamza mentioned earlier that don't let a crisis go to waste, and I think post-COVID world is definitely going to be one of those that is never going to go to waste. And I'll give you one reason. Some of the things that the UN has been advocating for the longest time, nobody was paying attention to them. Our Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, where we should care about water, sanitation, hygiene, health, and all of a sudden the pandemic hits, and all that you hear people talk about is how people do not have enough to eat, how people don't have enough, facilities for clean water and sanitation, how they don't have healthcare and all sorts of things. So this is one of the ways of actually literally accelerating our, the march towards the 2030 agenda. And I'm pretty certain that the post-COVID world will be a very different world where our priorities will be very different from what they used to exist before. That's all I want to say. Thanks.
I'll add a very small point to Shweta's response, very nice, comprehensive. Basically referred to our recent report on COVID-19 and its impact and assessment that we published about, I think, 2 weeks ago. It actually contains a discussion of a range of policy measures that are needed. I couldn't agree more. Health should be a little more broadly defined for sure and bring in all elements, and we do highlight those things. And now, as I was saying earlier in one of the responses, a UN system as a whole, globally in the region, is working together to support at the country level eventually. And we're getting into the details of the specific policy measures. When we say health, what exactly are we talking about? And then you open it up in the range of measures that are needed. So agree with the overall observations, yes.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to ask you a question from Pima Bazar, who says small countries such as Bhutan, or in small countries such as Bhutan, maybe that should be, it is excessively dependent on tourism. And in the wake of COVID-19, this is the sector that's hardest hit. How do we take care of people involved in this sector? So in Bhutan, a lot of dependency on tourism. What do we do about that in a post-COVID-19 world?
Well, services sector in general, including tourism and others, of course, are the hardest hit and immediate hits. We are based in Bangkok, Thailand, which is a country also relies very heavily on tourism related activities and revenues and so on and so forth. Pacific Island economies actually, of course, also depend quite a bit on tourism related stuff. So in general, the approach that we have been highlighting in the services sector domain is when we use the term targeted fiscal support or targeted measures, there are going to be businesses, in this case, tourist-related operators and activities and restaurants and businesses and so on and so forth, the whole sector will be affected. So government's measures should be targeted in those areas that are hit the hardest. This is what we mean by targeted support, be it in terms of making sure job retention measures are there or the resources are there for that, be it in terms of maintaining basic minimum living standards of people who have been affected, who are working or were associated with that particular industry. So governments will have to step in. Bhutan or other small countries have their own very specific challenges in terms of how much fiscal space they have, how much room they have, exactly what kind of identification and impact assessment needs to be done. And that is what is taking place now across the UN system, to get into those kind of nitty-gritty details, because situation varies considerably across different countries. So Bhutan or other countries may need more help in tourism compared to some other countries, for instance. So when we devise fiscal policy measures at the aggregate level, then the next step, of course, is how you are targeting it at those areas where most help is needed.
Thank you. Very, very clear. I have a follow-up question from JC Mercado, not on this particular, on the issue you've just spoken on, but one we've touched on earlier, who says sustainable investments and ESG components today cover very broad definitions and range in scope. Is there a standard metric with which we can measure these today? And I'll hand over to either of you on that one.
Well, that's Shweta went through that part of the presentation. I'll be happy to jump in, but explain what we're talking about in lack of standardization, essentially, in ESGs.
Sorry, let me actually just unmute. Thank you for your question. Actually, yes, there is a big problem in terms of moving towards these environmental, social, and governance factors, because they're not standardized. There's lack of technical understanding and awareness of metrics, criteria, and how they apply to different businesses. So that has actually created a lot of confusion, and this lack of standard is a big issue especially for investors who cannot compare the value addition of multiple projects because they may fall under different standards. One of the ways of moving towards this is, as I had mentioned earlier, something EU is doing, the European Union, and I think they have recently come out with some of the standards to actually call on what exactly is considered green, okay? So that everybody's on the same page, and something like this needs to be developed for our own region as well in order to move forward with these environmental, social, and government factors. Thanks. So do you want to add something?
I'm okay.
Thank you very much. So I have a question from Shaleen Singhal from the Terry School of Advanced Studies, who says, today's teenagers are experiencing COVID-19 and the resulting quarantine, and it's a unique phenomenon for many of us. And they shall probably, it says here, be dealing with such calamities in the near future. How do we use what they've learned and the opinions they've formed to shape a future, and hopefully a more sustainable and inclusive future? Is there something that we can take from this crisis to build on?
I was actually having this conversation with my teenager boys not long ago, a couple of days ago, because they are holed up in their rooms and I'm holed up in my room, in my home still, working online, and they're taking their classes. And we were just exchanging notes on how's the experience going so far. It's already 2 or 3 weeks for us. And it's different experiences. One of the boys loves it. He thinks this is the way to go about it. It gives him a lot of flexibility. He's taking breaks and going out for a run in the living small compound that we live in. Others is frustrated with the technology and interaction and lack of meeting friends or interacting with the teacher or follow-up questions. So there are lessons being learned as we go along virtually on daily basis. There are issues, we were just talking about overall health sector concerns, for instance. So mental health is another one that is being talked about now, and how to address, especially those youngsters who are already probably facing these things. And who knows, we'll be facing similar situations again. It's too early to say what exactly are the key 1, 2, 3 main lessons learned. But one thing is for sure, I think, as I said earlier also, the way we organize our lives or work, that is going to change permanently. And the teenagers and the youngsters who are going to be entering the job markets or entering the work lives or entering the policymaking sphere a few years down the line, they will very subconsciously bringing the lessons from this kind of experiences, and they will be doing things much more differently, much more willingly. Our generation, older people, have been talking about these things, but we never actually went through the things ourselves in the early stages of lives. And our ways were set in dressing up, going to work in a physical building, driving 45 minutes down the line. That thing is changing, and it's going to change fundamentally. So these are the lessons I think youngsters are much more open to internalize now. And when they're ready to really start engaging much more at a larger scale in the society, workspace, otherwise, they will automatically give shape to things big time. Much more impactful is my understanding. Shweta, anything you want to add?
No, just thanks actually, Hamza. No, just a little bit of the fact that, we were writing this report, the current report, before COVID came along. And we were arguing that climate emergency is one where we all have to make adjustments, which sounded kind of weird, right? Why is anybody going to make an adjustment when they're so cool and comfortable in their lifestyles? Mm-hmm. For some odd reason, COVID has just come in, and all of a sudden we've been shaken to our cores. What Hamza is mentioning, I mean, like everybody's holed up in their own little rooms or in their houses, can't go out. We are somehow learning to cope with this new sort of new normal or new normal, whatever you want to call it. And I think it will be a game changer. I think going forward, when for things like climate emergency or something, people are being asked to make some sacrifices, I think they'll be a little bit more willing and having this kind of an experience in mind. So I think it's a good experience for everybody. And I'm hoping that we'll come out as a winner after all this COVID is over and gone with. Thanks.
Thank you. And I have a question from Magda T, who's a governance consultant. And Magda says SDG 12, so the Responsible Consumption and Production Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 12 is directly related to public procurement. How can Asia-Pacific countries get the private sector to help them upgrade legacy systems to modernize procurement, make it more sustainable? Hamza, can I go to that to you? But maybe also Shweta will want to add, given that was, I think, linked to some of the part of her presentation.
Yeah, I was hoping Shweta to start the thing because she touched upon these things and one of the things that government needs to do. I think that from my point of view, the point is much more general. The sustainability principles are affecting all aspects of doing work and should be doing that. So procurement is one very specific example of that. There's going to be an issue of capacity build of government officials in many developing countries to try and come to terms with what exactly does that mean, how do we go about implementing those measures and those kind of things. And an element of standardizations will be needed that Shweta was explaining earlier. Anything specific, Shweta, you can add any example if you had in mind or any specific feature?
No, nothing. Thanks, Hamza, actually. Yes, I mean, like, as you mentioned that Hamza was mentioning public procurement system. I mean, like, that's a very special thing. You can actually bring more green aspects to it. You can actually have companies do more circular aspects in waste management. Okay, these are certain things that governments can encourage companies to do. And even businesses can be asked to measure the entire supply chain and, where are the emissions happening and how they can be actually taken care of. So a lot of these kind of things can actually be taken place through this procurement, circular economy sort of style things.
Thank you. And possibly the last question, maybe from Karthik Manikam, who's a research scholar at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, who says, my question is more in relation to actual methodology and epistemology. Given that a lot of pertinent social research requires field surveys, which are currently difficult to do, how do you see research and policy organisations, including UNESCAP itself, adapting to this new challenge? how do we address the kind of asterisks on the social data that will likely emerge out of the next few months?
Field research is one of the aspects of modalities or techniques of research. In certain areas, of course, it matters quite a bit. And right now, at least, of course, there's going to be limitations to pursue that kind of route. But on the flip side, what this technology and connections and work from home has, in a way, enforced upon us, and we have experienced it myself last 2 weeks, is the speed at which we have learned of what is going on in Latin America or East or Africa or West Asia region and so on and so forth, because we are interacting, speaking virtually on daily basis with colleagues across the globe within the UN system, trying to address these kind of data gaps or research gaps and information and lessons learned, right? So this is the other side of the things, that some of the gaps in research that we would have done in normal times would have taken far longer to read up online and do our thinking and discussion groups and all that. Now we are working and getting comfortable with learning experiences across the globe at a much faster pace. Hopefully, gradually, when the whole dust settles, then we go back and we are able to go out, actually. Field research will step in where needed to fill in the gaps on all those things. But I hope the lessons we are learning now of engaging with think tanks, for instance, researchers directly, which we were doing maybe once a year or once in 2 years. Now we have the opportunity and we are doing it at a much higher frequency. And that is the other side, which I hope continues over time as well. When we get the field elements of field study elements of research supporting these other new ways of doing research that we are learning.
Thank you. And actually, I think we've got time to squeeze in just one more, if that's all right with both of you. I think it's a good one to end on. We've got a question from Nisawan Pichdumrong, who says, does COVID-19 support SDG 12 in making people realize the importance of how to consume only what they need, for instance? Is this the wake-up call that our region and the world needs?
Well, very pertinent question for the last question for the conversation. Yes, it's a wake-up call, but not only for consumption, of many, many, many things. People are going to internalize the impact in different ways, for sure. But I'm sure all of us will agree it is having a profound way how we are thinking about it, virtually on daily basis. Not just what we're consuming or what we should be consuming, how we are organizing a day on every day. What is the purpose of life, if you want to go on the other spectrum? What we were doing before, why we had 2 cars parked in our garage now. Do we really need it? Because I haven't driven it in 3 weeks and nothing has happened. Sky is still blue, maybe more bluer now, in fact. So it's great. And so we're all learning and internalizing gradually these lessons, and it is a wake-up call, and we should wake up and then respond what is expected of us. It's a huge nudge from nature that here's your nudging, move in the right direction. Otherwise, the climate emergency, for instance, a lot of climate activists across the globe have been going hoarse, highlighting the issues, the scientific evidence, the data, the research, the reports. What not is out there. We all know that. And the global conversation is still partly here and there denying and not really taking the actions that are expected. Now is the call, wake-up call, as very nicely put. Do that. Otherwise, God forbid, in future, if there is such a similar climate-related emergencies across the globe, why we want to put ourselves in those conditions when we have learned that as a global society, it really, really damages us big time if we don't adjust our ways of doing things. Get the last words from you.
Thank you, Hamza. You said it all, actually, I think, but I would disagree. It's not a nudge, it's a push. I think really for all of us to rethink how we live our lives, basically. And I think everybody has been receiving through their social media or whatever, all the pictures of the birds coming out, the dolphins swimming again, and all the nice things that are happening around the world in terms of environment. And I think it gives everybody a pause that why is nature taking over now that the human beings have retreated? I think this is a good lesson to learn, that we can survive with them as long as we live within our own limits. So we really have to define our limits going forward. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm afraid that is indeed all we have time for today. So if you still have questions you'd like to ask, or we haven't quite got to your questions today, you can email us at escap-scas@un.org. That's escap, escap-scas@un.org, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. I would like to thank both Hamza and Shweta for their presentation, their answers, the clarity and aplomb with which they dealt with it all in spite of a couple of technical glitches. I'd like to hand over to them to say a goodbye before we finally close.
Thank you, Paul. All I'll say to all our listeners now is please now go out, download the report and read it. You are at home, you're not going anywhere. So take your time absorbing the messages in detail that are in the report. Thank you very much for your support and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you very much. And Shweta, any final words from you? No.
Just read our report. That's all.
The report's available online on the site and on the webpage that you've clicked on to join this conversation. So thank you once again, and goodbye for now.
Goodbye, everyone. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.